Hello, my name is Nate McCoy with the Iowa Golf Association, and I'm going to cover Rule 15, Relief from Loose Impediments and Movable Obstructions. Before we get into this rule, we're going to cover a quick purpose statement, and then we will hit 15.1 first, which is loose impediments, and then 15.2, which is movable obstructions. Now, Rule 15 is going to cover when and how the player may take free relief from either a loose impediment or a movable obstructions. These objects are not treated as being part of the challenge of playing the golf course, and the players are normally allowed free relief when they interfere with their play. I want to mention, though, that the player needs to be extremely careful in moving any loose impediment near his or her golf ball, especially off the putting green, because if they happen to move the golf ball while in the process of doing that, there will be a penalty. Now, before we get into the rule, I'm going to cover a quick um, definition of what a loose impediment is, and then we'll get into the rule itself. So, a loose impediment is any unattached natural object, such as stones, loose grass, leaves, branches, and sticks. It's also going to encompass any dead animals and animal waste, worms, insects, and similar animals that can be removed easily, and also the mounds or webs that they build, and lastly, any clumps of compacted soil, which include aeration plugs. And these are things that we generally see, in the spring and fall in our state. Now, there are items that are not considered loose impediments, and the definition of that would be any item or any object that is attached or growing or is solidly embedded in the ground that it cannot be picked out easily or is sticking to the ball, such as that mud in the far right picture. Now, there are times when uh, you're going to face circumstances where sand or loose soil are going to be near your golf ball. Just know this, that sand and loose soil are not considered loose impediments. You do have the ability to move those on the putting green or the teeing area, but anywhere on the golf course, you are not allowed to move those. The same goes for dew, frost, and water, which are also not considered loose impediments, but fall under kind of the same idea as sand and loose soil. Snow and natural ice are also kind of considered in that um, same definition. They can either, but these can either be considered either as a loose impediment or as temporary water. And it's kind of up to the player to decide what those items are, just because their state kind of changes over time. Now, we're going to get into the rule itself now. We're going to cover, firstly, the removal of loose impediments and kind of what the player's rights are, and uh, then cover what happens if the ball moved when removing a loose impediment. Now, a player may remove a loose impediment anywhere on or off the golf course without penalty, and may do so in any way, such as by using his hand, foot, club, or other equipment. Sometimes you'll see people use, towels sometimes to brush things away. But as mentioned earlier, the ball must not move uh, unless you're on the putting green or teeing area, which you would face no penalty if it was by accident. Now, if a player's removal of a loose impediment causes his or her ball to move, the ball must be replaced on its original spot. And if you cannot determine what that spot is, you are allowed under the rules to estimate that spot. Just make sure that when you are replacing this golf ball, that you are placing it and not dropping it. Now, if the ball had been moved anywhere on the golf course, you're going to receive a one-stroke penalty, except, as I said earlier, this is just to kind of push it home, but on the putting green or teeing area. Now, that was 15.1. We're going to move on to 15.2, which is going to start with two definitions. The first is the definition of an obstruction and the definition of a movable obstruction. An obstruction is any artificial object except for integral objects and boundary objects. An example of obstructions are artificially surfaced roads and paths, including their artificial borders, so any roads and curbs, for example, buildings and rain shelters, sprinkler heads, drains, and irrigation or control boxes, stakes, walls, railings, and fences, but not when these are boundary objects that define or show the boundary edge of a golf course, golf carts, mowers, cars, and other vehicles, waste containers, signposts, and benches, and lastly, any players of equipment, flagsticks, and rakes. Now, an obstruction can either be a movable obstruction or an immovable obstruction. And to start, if part of an immovable obstruction is going to meet, if it meets this definition, which I'm going to share with you real quick, um, this is a movable obstruction. Basically outline that an obstruction that can either be moved with reasonable effort and without damaging the obstruction or the golf course is going to be basically, if it falls into those 2 points, then it's going to be considered a movable obstruction. So um, this fence, for example, with the gate, if this fence gate can be moved with reasonable effort and without damaging the obstruction or the golf course, then it falls in the definition of what a movable obstruction is and can be moved. This is not going to apply, though, if the movable part of an immovable obstruction is not meant to be moved. So, for example, um, this stone wall here was not meant to have its stones removed, even though that it is possible to do so. This also includes when an obstruction is movable, where the committee may define it to be an immovable obstruction. So this fence here, basically is being held up by the weight of the logs. These logs can be easily removed, I'm sure, but the committee made a decision to define it as an immovable obstruction. So that was the beginning of that with the definitions. We're going to jump into 15.2, which is movable obstructions. We're going to do a quick intro and then um, head into 15.2a, which is relief from a movable obstruction, and then cover relief for a ball that's not found but in or on a movable obstruction. So to start the intro for this rule, basically you're going to receive free relief um, under the rules for being able to move any artificial object that meets the definition of a movable obstruction, which, as we stated earlier, is a item that can be easily moved or reasonably moved that won't cause damage to either the object or the golf course. It does not give relief from a movable obstruction. So this rule 15, is not going to cover immovable obstructions. If you'd like to learn how to take relief for, say, a cart path, for example, just turn it one chapter over to Rule 16.1, and you'll be able to find that there. It's also not going to cover, this rule is not going to cover anything under boundary objects or integral objects. You're not going to receive relief for those. Basically, the rules cover this in other parts of the book, but integral objects, for example, in this case below, you see a retaining wall for a pond, but it's inside the edge of a penalty area. As we know from penalty areas, we cannot receive relief for anything that's inside the penalty area, such as an obstruction. So without penalty, as I said earlier, a player is allowed to remove a movable obstruction anywhere on or off the golf course, and may do so in any way with 2 exceptions. The first exception is you are not allowed to remove tee markers of the hole that you are playing. So if there's if you hit a tee shot and your ball lands on a tee box of a different tee, for example, then by all means you're allowed to move those. But if it's the hole that you are playing, just make sure that you leave those where they're at. Second exception is when a player or caddy deliberately removes movable obstructions to affect the ball in motion. So in this case, there's a ball that's rolling towards the water, and the caddy is picking up something that had been laid down, possibly a rake. Those items must be left in place. Now, if a player's ball moves while he or she is removing a movable obstruction, so let's say in the case where a ball, is resting up against an item, um, you're obviously going to be able to receive relief from that situation. But if your ball happens to move, say for this example in this illustration where a ball is resting up against this rake, the rake is removed. In doing so, the ball moves. The ball just must be replaced on its original spot. Now, when your ball happens to be in or on a movable obstruction anywhere on the golf course except on the putting green, the player still is entitled to free relief and must lift the golf ball, remove the movable obstruction, and then drop the original ball on or another ball in the relief area. So um, basically, at this point, the reference point, if you're wanting to know, where is my reference point supposed to start? It's supposed to start at an estimated point, basically right underneath where the ball was at rest in or on the movable obstruction. The relief area, as in generally every other relief procedure, is going to be a one club length relief area. And the relief area that you are dropping in must be the same area of the golf course as the reference point. So if your reference point's in the general area, the golf ball must be dropped and stay in the general area. And as always, the ball um, must not end up closer to the hole than the reference point. Now, what happens if you're in the same situation, but instead of being just anywhere on the golf course, it's resting in or on a movable obstruction on the putting green? Um, Again, the player is entitled to or is entitled to free relief and is required to lift the golf ball, remove the movable obstruction, and then place the golf ball, which is the difference here. Instead of dropping, the player then places the golf ball at an estimated spot right under where the ball was at rest, in or on the movable obstruction. Um, now that's basically Rule 15. We covered, loose impediments and movable obstructions. Much of the rule is found in the definition, but if you would like to learn more, there is a lot more on these subjects on the full rules, which you can find at usga.org or in the rule book itself. If you do have any questions, always feel free to give us a call at the Iowa Golf office, and we'd be happy to answer those for you. We hope you have a great time this summer playing, and hope you don't have to deal too much with obstructions or loose impediments. Have a great day, and we'll see you down the road.